Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and now we're counting down to Christmas.
It is here.
Now,
Yeah,
have you done your Christmas shopping?
No.
Have you started?
No.
A little bit.
I've started thinking about.
Aren't we like less than 2 weeks now?
I kind of do Christmas shopping on the 23rd. That's kind of.
I think that week of Christmas is a good time.
If you're one of the
It's
people,
not a good time, but it's,
No,
the
it's
time
my
of year.
time. Yeah.
if you're one of the people that you're completely done Christmas shopping, I want to know.
Oh, there's lots of people that are
yeah.
done. Yeah.
I just want to know your ways. Like, how do you do this? When do you start? Is this a summer, or is it always post Thanksgiving? I don't know.
Yeah, my mother's been
Yeah.
accumulating things for months, and everything's wrapped and under the tree.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Granzy's on it.
for all my
Yeah.
all my kids.
Well, so last week was the last planned week of the series with a planned topic, because we took questions in our Let's Talk About series for the past 6 weeks? Was it 6 weeks?
It was a 6-week series. Yeah,
6 week
Yep.
series.
We did 7 weeks of podcasts on a 6-week series because we did an extra week.
That's
weeks
true,
on
yes.
2 weeks.
Sexuality.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
that's true. So we obviously, when you take questions, we got a lot of questions that didn't fit into maybe a topic or didn't get to make it. So it was
they
like,
weren't
this is
explicitly part of the series, but still people had
Questions.
interesting questions.
It's like,
Yeah.
you know what? I have a question, so I'm going to throw it into the forum. We're like, all right, let's do a catch-all. There's no one subject that captures all of these, so we might bounce around a little bit here with some random ones. And the first one to start off with was about dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs.
So when it comes to dinosaurs, we're not talking about Jurassic Park, but the first question was, why are dinosaurs not discussed or referenced in the Bible?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think about this. I think about Old Testament scholar named John Walton, who talks about the idea that the Bible is written for us, but not to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
That anytime we're coming to the scriptures, we need to remember it was written to a particular audience at a particular time and a place, a particular cultural context. It is for us, right? That we learn, God reveals himself to us through this ancient text. But the ancient text was originally written to a particular audience, a particular time and place. And so for us to wrestle faithfully with what the text means for us is to really have to think about that cultural context into which it was written. And, the discovery of dinosaur fossils, that is kind of how we know about these ancient creatures, is something that's much more of a recent scientific discovery. So the ancient people to whom the Bible was originally written probably didn't have reference to, awareness of these ancient creatures. And therefore, in some sense, for the Bible to talk about these creatures would not have computed, right? It would be like if the ancient text wrote about, airplane, like the people of the ancient text would be like, what is that? I don't know what that is. And so just the recognition that the Bible is God's revelation, but it's God's revelation that is given to a particular people at a particular time and place, and then the meaning of that we have to translate from their cultural context to ours. And so it's written in ways that the people of that particular time, in that particular cultural context, would have understood.
Yeah, and I when I think about a question like that, I think about maybe a different question I would ask is, what's the purpose of the Bible?
Yeah.
And it's God's revelation of himself.
Yeah.
The Bible is a story of God. It's a story about us and God, but first and foremost, it's the story of God. And so it's a story of God's plan of rescue and redemption and salvation for all of humanity. And so the purpose isn't about natural history or science, right? It's the purpose is God revealing himself to us. And so I don't, very similar, I wouldn't expect it to include something like dinosaurs or lots of other things that we might have questions
There's all kinds
about.
of things that we might be curious about.
Right,
the
that
Bible
isn't
doesn't.
in the Bible.
Right,
Yeah, so that's kind of how I talk about that.
Yeah. I think it's important to note, in some ways, maybe something underneath the question is this kind of relationship between the Bible and science, and particularly around issues regarding creation, the creation accounts, and just the importance of recognizing that what we're given in the creation accounts isn't some kind of exhaustive scientific explanation. It is God's revelation of himself to a particular people in a particular time and place. And for us to faithfully wrestle with what's there has to take that seriously. And part of that is just recognizing that ancient cosmology, right? Ancient questions around origins of the physical world were very, very different than the kinds of questions we ask today. And that we today find ourselves preoccupied with questions like when and how, right? So we want to know, when did this happen and how did it happen? And science really is wrestling with when and how. The ancient world, the ancient account of creation is not preoccupied with when and how. The ancient account, the biblical account, is preoccupied with who and why.
Yeah.
And so when we come to this ancient text that's all about who and why, with questions that are preoccupied with when and how, we'll get goofy in all kinds of ways, right? And so there's just the recognition that we need to come to the text with the preoccupation of the ancient author, of the ancient audience, and what God was revealing to them in that time and place. Let the text set the agenda, rather than us bringing our contemporary scientific agenda and expecting this ancient text to somehow speak.
Yeah, it was never meant to.
Truth, right? That it's not meant to do. So, but when we come to the text and recognize the author's agenda for his audience, recognizing that this is really preoccupied with who, that is God, made everything that exists. In fact, even in the days of creation, the various things that are created on each day are all things that among Israel's ancient neighbors, they pointed to as gods. The sun was a god, the moon was a god, the rakia, this dome, this, forget the typical English translation, but the idea being this sort of
the expanse,
the expanse, right? Yep. That all of these things were worshipped among Israel's neighbors as gods. And Israel's story is no, God spoke and it came into existence. God spoke and it came into existence. God spoke and it came into existence. It's a way of defending the claim that there is only one true God, Israel's God. And so the text is preoccupied with who, that is God, and why, to create this world as a place that he would dwell with his image bearers and that they would worship him. So when we come to the text, we have to wrestle with what was the original author and his audience, and what is the agenda of that author for his audience. Otherwise, we wind up getting goofy with trying to bring our agenda to this ancient text that didn't set out to answer the kind of questions that we sometimes bring.
It's good.
So Stegosaurus versus Brachiosaurus. Next question submitted says, what does the Bible really say about the role of wives versus husbands? What does spiritual leadership really look like? What about for wives who are gifted with leadership and husbands who are wired more as a follower?
Oh boy. I'm going to dive into all
That's
that.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
I'm just reading what the people have.
Yep, that's what the people want to know.
Yeah.
Where to start? Gosh.
Let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it. That would be a great for let's talk about it round two.
Yeah.
So there are a few sort of core passages that speak to the relationship of husbands and wives, and sometimes the question makes reference several times to the word leadership. And oftentimes leadership is part of what people are, again, coming to the text, asking questions about leadership and kind of hierarchy and status. And again, I don't think that that's what the agenda of the original author is in writing about marriage. That Paul in particular in Ephesians 5, Peter in 1 Peter 3, they're not so much interested in hierarchy and in leadership. In fact, the language of leadership isn't language that's used there. So Paul in Ephesians 5 begins with this admonition, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ, right? So he begins with what I believe is the fundamental posture of discipleship, which is setting aside yourself for the sake of others. That as disciples of Jesus, that's what we're called to. Philippians 2 calls us to this kind of way of life that is setting aside ourselves for the sake of others. Ephesians 5 applies that posture of discipleship, a self-sacrificial love, to the context of marriage and begins with, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then it says, wives to your own husbands as unto the Lord. So so the application of this is, wives, you to adopt this posture of self-sacrificial love. setting aside yourself for the sake of the other in the context of your marriage. When it gets to husbands, it doesn't repeat the same verb, submission. The verb for husbands is, it's actually stronger. It's die, like love your wife as Christ loved the church. That is a kind of dying to self for the sake of the other. And so I believe for both husbands and wives in that passage, you see this profound call to setting aside oneself for the sake of the other. I don't think Ephesians 5 means that I have a kind of trump card for decision making, because it often, again, gets applied to specifically the idea of decision making. Who gets to make the final call in decisions? Kim and I have been married for 28 years, and we've managed to navigate in ways that I've never had to come back and go, well, you know, Ephesians 5 says you have to submit to me, so I get to make the final call. Like, it hasn't worked that way.
You don't lay down the senior pastor
I don't
card.
lay down the, I don't lay down the Ephesians 5 trump card, right? And so I think this is a call for us husbands and wives to a kind of mutual submission to one another. It's applying the posture of discipleship to the context of our marriage. I think you see that very much again in what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3. That language of submission gets used again, and that causes deep consternation for many modern readers. Ancient readers wouldn't have batted an eye at it because it was just what was expected of wives in that cultural context. The thing is just to note, in the first century culture, what gets said to the wives in both Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter 3 is just what would be culturally expected. What gets called forth from the husbands is actually radically countercultural. So Peter speaks to the husband, says, husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way, as with the weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of Christ. Now, there's several pieces of that make you go, whoa, wait, hang on, what does that say? So husbands likewise live with your wives. The Greek literally says kata gnosis, according to knowledge, right? Like, you're supposed to understand your wife, which 28 years, I'm still working on that one, right? There's a lot of differences. And Peter's pointing out that women and men are different. Live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel. And you go, hold on, time out, wait a second, what? And I don't think Peter's suggesting that wives or women are constitutionally weaker than men. I mean, I was present when my wife gave birth to our children. Like, she's not constitutionally weaker.
There's no way I could do that.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, there is the reality that God has made men typically physically stronger.
Sure.
And yet, I think that there's actually something in the picture that Peter is using when he says a weaker vessel. And I think about vessels at my house in our kitchen. We have way up high the china that my mother received when she got married, and then we have way down low in the bottom shelves where the kids can easily get to it, the plastic cup from the Ranger game, right? Now, which one of those is a weaker vessel? Well, the ones that are way up high, right? The stronger vessel is now, of course, they didn't have plastic cups in the ancient world, but they did have different kinds of vessels, some that were more sturdy for everyday use, and then some that were to be treasured and handled with care. And I think that's part of what Peter is getting at there. Is husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, as something that you would hold with tenderness and care, which wasn't always what was expected of husbands in the ancient world. And grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. Again, this is actually really strong language in the first century world for the equality of the husband and wife. She is a fellow heir of the grace of life. Therefore, you must grant her honor. And he says, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered, which I think is really interesting. This is Peter saying, your prayers are going to be hindered. God's not all that interested in hearing your prayers, man, if you're not actually living with your wife in this way, loving her in that way, treating her with tender care, granting her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. So, I mean, those are a couple of the passages that deal with some of the dynamic, I think, that's being asked out of the question.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, you pointed this out in the beginning, that idea of leadership is often, spiritual leadership is this common idea that comes about. And Paul actually never talks about that, particularly in the passage that you referred to. It says husbands are the head of the wives, but it never talks about headship, which is where we often get that idea of leadership. He makes no reference to that, no reference to male or husband headship. And headship and leadership have become one and the same. And so when he talks about submitting, and again, he begins by this idea of mutual submission. That word submit means a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. It's this voluntary humbling, this giving away of power, surrendering rights. And when you think about in the idea of mutual submission, it's self-emptying mutuality, that both husband and wife are doing this for each other. They're seeking the good, the interest of one another. And I think what Paul is getting to, particularly in that passage later on, he points to creation and the very first marriage between Adam and Eve as this, we see them joining together as one flesh, this picture of oneness and unity. And he uses this metaphor of the head and the body to show us this image of unity and oneness and mutuality that marriage should point to, that it's this reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church. Yeah. How does Christ love the church? By giving himself up for her. And to your point, that is such a stronger, higher call almost for husbands than it is for wives. And as husbands love their wives in this sacrificial way, so then wives submit, respecting their husbands in that way. I think we often mistakenly focus on this division of power rather than what Paul is pointing us to is, no, this is this image of unity and this reflection of what Jesus has done for the church. So now marriage should point to that. This relationship brings glory to God by pointing others to the love of Christ in this way.
Yeah, so good. And part of what's interesting, even looking at, especially think about the Ephesians 5 passage in its a little bit broader context, Paul is addressing there what's called the household code. So he talks husbands, wives, fathers, children, and slaves and masters. It's actually children, fathers. And part of what's really interesting to note in this progression, these three sets of two, he addresses wives, then husbands. He addresses children's fathers. He addresses slaves and masters. The first one in each pair is what would have been considered in the first century the culturally weaker one, and then the culturally stronger one. The first one in each pair is different, whereas actually the second one in each pair is the same. The husband would be the father, would be the master. And again, in each of those first ones, what is said is essentially what would have been culturally expected, although given kind of a theological justification. Whereas what's said in the second one, to the one who's actually the culturally more powerful, is the one that is radically countercultural. So we hear wives submit in the 21st century context, and we get like, whoa, that feels right, kind of backwards.
Yeah.
Whereas what actually is happening is in the first century world, the second one is this sort of culturally radical call to live and love differently than what would have been the cultural expectation and the theological reasoning for that. And so in each one of those, there's actually a kind of giving away of power of the culturally more powerful one in the pairing.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and I think even with this question, I think the person asks, well, what about if the wife has the leadership gift and the husband is a follower? And what I would say to that is, this idea of mutual submission and self-emptying mutuality is that we make space, husband and wives make space for each other to use their gifts. Like as an outside observer, I see that in your relationship with Kim, where Kim's incredibly gifted and passionate about her work with My Refuge House. And we clearly see Barry's gifting as senior pastor and preacher and all of that. I see both of them make space. Like I see what you do for Kim and the sacrifices she makes for you for each of you to live out God's call on your life. That's what Paul is pointing to.
And, I mentioned like 28 years, I've never played the Ephesians 5 trump card. I get to make the final decision here. But for 28 years, it's been a lifestyle for her, and I hope for me as well, for us, to practice that kind of self-giving, sacrificial love for the sake of the other as a way of life and not merely sort of in particular instances where decisions get made.
Right. That's good.
All right. Next question.
Barry,
we know that you have Luther's 95 Theses on your back as a tattoo, but so I pretty much know how you feel about this one, probably. But this question submitted said, "Are tattoos?"
Now our listeners are going,
what?
Does he really?
You'll never know.
You'll never know, will you?
You'll never know.
You'll never know. Unless we meet up at the public pool, I suppose.
Or you wear that one baptism shirt.
That baptism shirt.
The hole in
the holy baptism shirt.
This question submitted is, are tattoos a sin? What does the Bible say?
Yeah, so This has actually come up in my family, so I thought this was a really funny one. We've actually talked about this. My brother has numerous tattoos, and my mother is not very pleased with all his tattoos. And so often what the scripture that's referenced is Leviticus 19:28. So it says, "Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord." And I think it's so interesting. Again, like, we have to read scripture in the context in which it's written, right? It's written to this audience. What's going on? Why does God give this command to Israel? And he does it as a part of a larger group of prohibitions that he gives to Israel, to say, this is how you are to live, so that you will set yourselves apart from the unbelieving nations that surround you, because you are my people and you are holy. Because at this time, in this ancient culture, tattoos and body markings were often associated with pagan rituals around idol worship and mourning the dead and things like that. And so what God is saying is like, no, you are my people. You worship me. And so don't do this, because this is what the other nations that worship other gods do. So when you come to the New Testament, you don't have those kinds of prohibitions, because it's a different time. And what you see is Paul and other writers talk about honoring God with your bodies, and I think that's what we're called to do. And so the short answer is no, I don't think tattoos are sinful, but I think we're called to honor God with our bodies. And so there's some, just like we would with any other thing we would do with our bodies, I think some questions to ask is, well, why do you want to get a tattoo, and what's the contents around it? Like, is this for vanity or for pride, or this is what everybody's doing, and so you want to, you're giving into peer pressure, approval, or things like that, just like you would ask for anything else you would do. And then think about those kinds of questions. But in short, I would say no, tattoos are certainly not sinful.
Oh, see, I was just going to say yes, they are.
Yeah,
for sure.
And Barry has different. We disagree, and
we don't. No, we agree completely. I think your answer was great. Like, that recognition of the ancient context, once again, of this was a ritual within the ancient world that had a particular meaning associated with it, that was connected to the worship of pagan gods, right? And so you come to the contemporary context, and there's not the same meaning connected with the practice. And so we shouldn't just completely dismiss the practice because it meant something in the ancient world that it doesn't mean today. Now, I think what you're pointing at in terms of, like, what is the meaning of what you're wanting to put on your body? Like, what's the significance? And is it something that can be honoring in the way that we, make a permanent mark on our bodies in that way? But I don't think there's anything that's inherently sinful. And I don't think that ancient prohibition was getting at something inherently sinful so much as culturally problematic for God's people to have some markings on their bodies that would mimic practices that were associated with pagan worship.
Now all the teenagers are gonna clip this part out and use this in part
Pastor
of their,
Barry said.
Yeah, part of their arguments to their parents. Last question here says, can you be okay with something being legal to do if you don't believe it is biblically right?
So, I think with this is there's a wide variety of places you can go with, well, what exactly are we talking about? But I would begin by saying in Romans 13, Paul talks about governing authorities and respecting the laws and understanding that many times laws don't perfectly align with God's commands and God's standards. Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. And so that's certainly true. And at the same time, I think there's space as Christians to advocate for laws when we see that they don't align with Christian values. So perhaps it's about the vulnerable, the poor. How do we care for those who are oppressed? I think there's space within lawful ways where we can advocate against unjust laws and changes to those laws. I think there's also times where we actually have to stand up against unjust laws. I think of cases like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, Nazi Germany, and Hitler, and how, quite honestly, the church was silent in both cases during those times where there were opportunities to stand. I mean, we see that in Scripture where Peter says in Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. And so I think there's discernment and wisdom that needs to to take place to consider which one of these do I need to apply in this situation. Is this an opportunity where I advocate within the legal system for changes in laws? Is this a time where I just need to stand up against this unjust law and think about it in that sense?
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add to that. I think you're spot on that. There will never be a day, I don't think, in this side of glory where there's a perfect alignment between Christian ethics and governmental policies. We as Christians should advocate for governmental policies that are just and that make possible our living faithfully according to our own ethics. But there's always going to be, a gap between those two, and so the opportunity to advocate for policies, the opportunity to stand against what we perceive to be unjust policies. But there's also then this principle, Paul talks about the idea of like, who am I to judge those outside the church? Let judgment begin with the house of God. Peter talks about that. And so I think we have to be careful that we don't impose our ethics on those outside the church. That in some sense, what Paul's doing there is saying like, the world is going to act like the world. Like, don't be surprised by that. And it's not our job to police the world. Really, it's our job to live faithfully according to our own ethical standards. And this is part of what you see in the early church, is that they brought about transformation of the Roman Empire, not by imposing their ethics on the empire, but by living their ethics faithfully. And as they lived their ethical calling faithfully, it actually brought about transformation of the empire. The empire saw something beautiful and compelling in the way that Christians lived. And so I believe our call today, our primary concern should be to faithfully live out our own ethical standards, not so much a preoccupation with trying to impose our ethical standards on those outside the church.
That's good. That's really good.
All right, I have a quicker one before we do banter at the end.
Okay.
But someone put in this.
We've skipped banter.
I know
we've
skipped
so we got to
some
get the banter.
People love their banter. But this one says, not a question, just had to say what a great series this has been, tackling tough topics and translating the Lord's message to relate to today's world. Thank you for creating the Let's Talk About It series. And I just want to throw out there real quick, did you have a favorite podcast from this past series?
I think I had a tie.
A tie.
I think I had a tie. So mine was, I think, politics, because it was so appropriate to where we were in that time, and I think it was such a good word in the moment we were in. But then secondly, if we weren't probably in the election season, I think I would have said money, just because I think it's so overlooked, and I really believe that such a key part of being a disciple of Jesus is to become a generous person. And I want us to be a church where we talk about it, because we want people to experience the joy and the freedom that comes in that, And so, those would be mine.
Those are fun. I think I really enjoyed the chance to spend 2 episodes talking about sexuality, just because it is such an important topic to talk about.
So many questions.
There's so many questions around it. Such a pressing cultural topic or set of topics. And yet, in our task as preachers, it's sometimes difficult to work into a sermon that we want to be about the gospel, about inviting people to trust in Christ. And so, not wanting to give sort of a disproportionate amount of a Sunday worship gathering space to talk about these kinds of questions. And yet they are so important. And so for us to have the chance to just have a extended conversation around some of those important topics, I thought it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you can't fit all of that in 30 minutes, and it wouldn't. Yeah, so that's true.
Was like 38 for Barry.
Wait, watch it. I haven't preached 38 in a long time.
He could if he wanted, but
if he wanted. I think the politics one was probably my favorite one. I love when we can talk about something. I mean, all the stuff is relevant topics. I mean, this is the whole purpose of the series, and that's why I love this series so much.
Yeah. And I just want to say, I think you've done such a great job at helping us navigate this. Like you, kind of guiding this process has been really, really great. Led to some, I think, really solid episodes.
Well, thank you all for taking the questions and from all the people and everybody listening that submitted questions.
Great questions,
in our church. Yeah. People not in our church, just throwing out some really great questions, and hopefully you picked up some type of biblical wisdom for these topics. But typically, most episodes, we end the last few minutes of the episode with some banter, with some fun, some random topic. This is where the peeps conversation originally started, all this different stuff. So this question this week for us is, what are 2 things that people would be surprised to know about you? 2 things.
2 things. I always struggle on questions like
Besides
this.
your back
especially,
tattoo.
my back tattoo, the 95 theses on my back. That's a good idea. Maybe I need to try it. You know,
And the helipad.
part of it for me is just the fact that so if I have anything fun or funny to share, I share in a sermon because I'm looking for material, and so I feel like I don't have a whole lot left. But anyway, I have a couple things, but I want to hear yours.
Mine. Okay, so I was going to share 2 things. I guess they're more like bucket list things, maybe. So I think I could categorize them that way. So did you have like superlatives in high school? Do you know what superlatives are? Okay, I don't know. Like best looking, most likely to succeed. Like that's a big thing. I mean, we've had them in high school, and so I came in 2nd place, which I was like first loser for most likely to succeed. I was really mad about that, but I won class comedian. And that's not the thing that you don't know about me. The thing that you don't know about me is I still have my bucket list. I'm going to do this. Is I want to do stand-up comedy at Gotham Comedy Club in New York City. Okay. That's on my list.
Nice.
I think I'd be pretty good at it. I'm going to try it. But it's a little like intimidating for whatever reason. And it's not even the public speaking thing. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's one thing.
Yeah.
What was my second thing?
See, I don't think I could be like funny on demand. Like I try hard to bring some humor into my preaching, but it's not my strong suit exactly.
We're not Craig. Craig's like he kills it.
I was actually, while you're thinking of that.
Yeah, what were you?
So in 10th grade at Mart High School, you've talked about my year that I spent in
Mart
a
High
little
School.
small town of Mart, Texas. I was voted the friendliest. There was a guy and a girl, so I was the friendliest, and like introverted me, the friendliest in 10th grade. So
I feel like it kind of says that you're a flirt.
I think it's what it says. I think that's what I was spending the year
That's the
doing.
West Texas way of saying. My second one was, this is also on my bucket list. Like I kind of always think about, if I wasn't a pastor, what would I do? Or what will I do like sometime in the future? I really want to run a restaurant. Like I really want to own and run a restaurant. It could be like, if I wasn't in Dallas, I would say food truck, because I think that would be a lot of fun. I just think 100 degrees in a food truck sounds miserable to me. But I really enjoy like seeing people find joy in eating a really good meal. And so I think that would be a lot of fun it's a lot of work. I have family who owns restaurants, and I just see the amount of stress and work it is. But I think there'd be something fun about that.
I got 100% seeing you be the person that comes out towards, kind of towards the end.
Oh, I love that.
I just want to check in on you. How's it been tonight?
Yeah.
Type of thing. Yeah.
And like the whole, like, something's going wrong and you got to fix it. Like, I love that moment of like, we got to figure this out right now.
See, I don't think I could
pressure.
handle the restaurant piece of it, but I would love to do like a coffee cocktail bookstore combination
there we go.
Where it's like you got a really curated bookstore of like great books, and then you have a little
good coffee.
Have a good cup of coffee or a nice mixed drink.
I'm reading a good book right now on the history of bookstores, bookshops.
Really?
It's great. Huh. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
I might have to get that title from you. Okay, so 2 things for me. So, one is the question is people would be surprised about. So, I have formally studied 5 different languages formally, and I'm terrible. I was terrible at all of them. Yeah. But I took Spanish in college, Greek and Hebrew in seminary, and French and German in my PhD. So I have formally studied 5 different foreign languages, and I'm terrible at foreign languages. Like all of them, I just struggled so mightily. So anyway, that was one that I thought of. The other I shared with you guys that in middle school I played the euphonium.
So, that's right.
A euphonium, and you were like, "What's the euphonium?"
What is the euphonium?
So I've compared it to like a tuba that you put in the dryer. It's like a shrunken tuba. It's the smaller version of a tuba. So turns out the band director was a euphonium player, and I showed up going, I don't know what I want to play, but I signed up for band like 7th grade, and so she was like, here, you're going to play the euphonium. So it was her thing that I got sort of assigned to, and the reason I thought about it because I always think about it anytime I hear the Christmas song "Little Drummer Boy," which, as an aside, is like the worst Christmas song at least among religious Christmas songs. We have the whole Mariah Carey.
Don't be
thing.
hating
That's
on this song.
Little Drummer Boy.
I like
man,
this.
that's a terrible.
It's better
song.
than
It's a
Santa
terrible
Baby.
song. I'm talking
Well-
about among religious
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Christian songs,
Yeah, yeah,
Christmas
yeah.
songs. Anyway, we can have a debate about
That's
that
a whole
later,
other
but
banter
there's-
topic.
Yeah. But we played Little Drummer Boy in my 7th grade band concert, and the euphonium just has one note the whole time. So the whole song, I'm just playing boom, 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 and it just goes on, and you could just hear the euphonium player playing that one note
entire song.
the whole song. So anyway, I always think about 7th grade band when I hear the terrible Christmas song, Little Drummer Boy.
Did you not watch the little show? Like, I just watched this the other night.
The Little Drummer Boy show?
Or that little show.
Is it a
on Christmas
claymation?
time?
Oh
thing?
yeah, the
Yeah,
claymation
yeah.
one.
Little
Yeah,
claymation.
yeah, I like claymation.
Mary's like, stop playing your drum. He's trying to sleep.
Put that away.
So I was in high school, all 4 years of high school. I was in a show choir.
Nice.
So like picture like Glee, but show choir.
Yeah. Wow.
so that throws
You're
some
like
people off.
dancing and singing.
Oh, yeah.
All at the same time.
Yep.
Wow.
One year we did like head.
I need to see some video
Yeah.
evidence of
had
this.
a head mic one year with the bye 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 dance.
Oh, let's go. Yeah.
Did a solo in the Rent. We did a Rent
Oh, wow.
medley.
Yeah.
Santa Fe. That was one of my songs.
Oh wow.
Yeah, we performed in like Washington D.C. and Disney World.
Look
and
at you.
all the stuff. So that throws some people off because I'm more of like a chill dude, and
Oh, but you got it in you,
Will
huh?
Jones
why
talked
you-
about your history of
I don't know if it's ever
singing all the
came
show
up.
tunes that my kids grew up singing.
Yep. So,
So-
and then the second one I've been to. So there's 45 state parks in Kentucky. Went to every single one of them
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
as a kid. Back when my dad and I actually, spoke on this earth. But that was one of his things when I was smaller. I was like, hey, we
State
did a lot
parks.
of camping.
Wow.
And like camp, like tent camping,
Yeah.
not the whatever, but did all the state parks.
Wow.
And was even in like some like article in a newspaper and of like dad and son goes to
You
every
hit 'em
state
all.
park.
That's
And
amazing.
so anyway, we've been to
Kentucky
every
state
county
parks.
in the state of Kentucky.
Wow.
But love Kentucky.
Fascinating.
All right.
So anyway, that's random 2 things.
There
Yeah.
we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Banter's back.
It is back.
What a great return of banter.
Thanks for everyone who submitted questions over the past 6-7 weeks.
Submit some banter questions now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give us
Yeah.
some banter
Well,
questions.
that's a good one.
There's
Yeah.
some banter questions,
Send
and
us.
we'll have some fun with it. But we'll be back with another episode of Formed.